Deep in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, a young mother named Sarah struggled to keep her 3 7-year-old sons warm in a borrowed trailer, unaware that her late husband had left her something extraordinary. For 2 years since his death, she had endured the cruelty of her in-laws, who treated her like a burden and her triplets like unwanted mouths to feed. They mocked her poverty, questioned her worth, and finally threw her out into the bitter winter cold with nothing but the clothes on their backs. What Sarah didn't know was that her husband had been the secret heir to a vast fortune, a legacy hidden in a safety deposit box she never knew existed. Her in-laws had known all along, waiting for the right moment to claim it for themselves. But could 3 small boys and their mother's unshakable love be enough to uncover the truth? What would happen when the family who cast them out discovered what they had lost? Margaret Brennan stood in the doorway of the grand estate, a tall woman in her late 60s whose elegant wool coat and pearl necklace seemed designed to emphasize the vast gulf between her world and the shivering family on her front steps. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes held all the warmth of the ice coating the fountain in the center of the circular driveway. Behind her, just visible in the shadows of the foyer with its crystal chandelier and marble floors, stood Richard Brennan, Daniel's older brother, his arms crossed, and his expression one of satisfied vindication. Sarah stood on the stone steps, her breath forming white clouds in the bitter December air, while her 3 7-year-old sons huddled against her legs, their small bodies trembling from cold and confusion. Ethan, the oldest by 3 minutes, had his arms wrapped protectively around his brothers Noah and Liam, his young face set in an expression of defiance that broke Sarah's heart. They each clutched a single garbage bag containing their few belongings, everything they owned in the world reduced to what could be carried in 2 hands. "I want you to understand something, Sarah," Margaret said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of old Southern wealth, each word precisely enunciated and sharp as a blade. "This is not cruelty, this is necessity. For 2 years, we have fed you, housed you, and tolerated your presence in this family. And what have you given us in return? Nothing but expense and obligation. My son Daniel made a terrible mistake marrying you, a decision that caused this family nothing but embarrassment and strain, and we are finally correcting that error." Sarah felt the words like physical blows, but she forced herself to stand straighter, to meet her mother-in-law's cold gaze without flinching. "Daniel loved me," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "He loved these boys. Whatever you thought of our marriage, he chose me. And he would be ashamed to see you treat his children this way." Richard stepped forward into the winter light, his face hardened by years of entitlement and disappointed expectations. "Daniel is dead. He's been dead for 2 years, and you've been living off this family's charity ever since. You're a young woman, perfectly capable of working and supporting yourself. It's time you learn to stand on your own 2 feet, instead of depending on the Brennan name and fortune." Margaret's expression did not change as she delivered her final words. "The decision has been made. You have until noon to vacate the property. Your vehicle is parked by the service entrance. We've placed $500 in the glove compartment, which is far more than we're obligated to provide. What you do with it and where you go is no longer our concern." Before Sarah could respond, Liam broke free from his brothers and lunged forward, his small fists pounding against the massive oak door. "No, Grandma, please. We'll be good. We won't eat so much. Please don't make us leave." For just a moment, something flickered across Margaret's face, a shadow that might have been doubt or shame, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "This was never your home, child," she said, her voice softer but no less final. "Your father should have known better than to bring his unfortunate choices into this family." The door closed with a heavy thud that echoed across the snow-covered grounds, and Liam collapsed against it, sobbing. Sarah sank to her knees to gather him into her arms, while Ethan and Noah pressed close, their tears freezing on their cheeks in the bitter wind that swept down from the mountains. And in that moment, huddled together on the cold stone steps of a house that had never truly been their home, the 4 of them clung to each other as the only warmth in a world that had suddenly become impossibly cruel. The drive from the Brennan estate to Rosa Martinez's property took 40 minutes along winding mountain roads that grew narrower and more treacherous with each passing mile. The old station wagon's engine coughing and sputtering as Sarah coaxed it up steep inclines and around hairpin turns where the guardrails had long since rusted away. The boys sat in silence in the back seat, their garbage bags clutched on their laps, their eyes wide as they watched the landscape transform from the manicured wealth of their former prison to the raw, unforgiving beauty of the deeper mountains. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white, not from the treacherous road but from the effort of holding herself together, of not allowing the tears burning behind her eyes to fall where her sons could see them. She had called Rosa from a gas station payphone, her voice breaking as she explained what had happened, and the elderly woman had not hesitated for even a moment before saying, "Yes, of course, come immediately." The trailer was empty, and they were welcome to it for as long as they needed. Rosa's property sat at the end of a rutted dirt road that climbed through dense pine forest. A small clearing carved from the wilderness where a modest house with peeling paint stood beside a much smaller structure that could barely be called a trailer. It was more of a camper, really, an ancient aluminum rectangle propped up on cinder blocks, its once white exterior now streaked with rust and green moss. Rosa emerged from her house as Sarah pulled up, a tiny woman with a cloud of white hair and a face creased by 70 years of hard living and harder losses, and she rushed to embrace Sarah before the younger woman could even fully exit the car. "Mija, Mija," Rosa whispered, holding Sarah tight while the triplets climbed out and stared at what would be their new home. "Those people, they have no souls, but you are safe now. You and your boys, you are safe." She led them to the trailer, apologizing with every step for its condition, explaining that it had not been used in 3 years, not since her nephew had lived there briefly before moving to Texas. The door stuck when she tried to open it, swollen from moisture and neglect, and when it finally gave way with a screech of protesting metal, the smell that wafted out was musty and cold, the scent of abandonment. Inside was a single room, barely 12 feet long, with a narrow bed built into one end, a tiny 2-burner stove, a miniature sink, and a bathroom so small Sarah could not imagine how she would fit inside it with the door closed. There was no insulation, and the December cold had seeped into every corner, making their breath visible even indoors. The windows were clouded with grime, and when Sarah flipped the light switch, nothing happened. Rosa hurried to check the breaker, explaining that the electricity had been turned off to save money, but she would have it reconnected immediately. The triplets set down their garbage bags and instinctively moved together onto the narrow bed, huddling close for warmth, their arms wrapped around each other in a tangle of small bodies and frightened eyes. Sarah stood in the center of the tiny space, taking in the water stains on the ceiling, the curling linoleum floor, the ancient curtains hanging limp over the dirty windows, and felt the full weight of their situation crash down on her with suffocating force. She had $517, 3 traumatized children, no job, no prospects, and winter closing in like a fist around them. Rosa touched her arm gently and said she would bring blankets and food, that everything would be all right, but Sarah could barely hear her over the roaring in her ears. She nodded mechanically, thanked her friend in a voice that did not sound like her own, and waited until Rosa had left before she turned away from her sons and pressed her fist against her mouth to muffle the sob that tore from her chest, her shoulders shaking with the force of tears she could no longer contain. Sarah had finally composed herself and was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand when she heard a sound from the narrow bed that made her freeze, a soft whimpering that was distinctly not human. She turned slowly to see Ethan unzipping his winter coat with a guilty expression on his face, and from inside the fabric emerged a small golden head with floppy ears and dark eyes that blinked in the dim light of the trailer. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice small and frightened, clearly expecting anger or punishment. "We couldn't leave him. We couldn't leave any of them." Noah and Liam were already unzipping their own coats, and suddenly there were 3 golden retriever puppies tumbling onto the bed, their tails wagging frantically, their pink tongues lolling as they climbed over each other, and the boys in a mass of fur and joy. They were perhaps 6 months old, still gangly and uncoordinated, their paws too big for their bodies, but healthy and clearly well-loved. Sarah felt her heart sink even as something in her chest simultaneously lifted at the sight of her sons' faces, transforming from fear to hope as they gathered the puppies close. "Their names are Scout, Ranger, and Bear," Liam explained, holding the smallest of the 3 against his chest. "Daddy gave them to us right before he died. He said every boy needs a dog, and since there were 3 of us, we needed 3 dogs. Grandma Margaret said we had to get rid of them, that they were dirty and cost too much money. But we hid them in the old gardener's shed, and we've been sneaking food to them for months and months, and she never knew." The full picture crystallized in Sarah's mind with devastating clarity. Her sons, already grieving their father, forced to hide the last gift he had given them. Sneaking out in the cold and dark to care for these animals because the people who should have loved them had denied them even this simple comfort. She thought of the meals the boys had barely touched over the past months, food she had assumed they were wasting, now understanding they had been smuggling it to the shed. She thought of how they had asked for extra blankets, claiming they were cold, and realized those blankets had gone to keep 3 puppies warm through the winter. "We had to bring them, Mom," Noah said, his voice breaking. "We couldn't let Grandma find them after we left. She would have had them taken away or worse. They're all we have left of Daddy. Please don't make us give them up, please." Sarah looked at the 3 puppies, who were now investigating their new surroundings with the boundless curiosity of young dogs, sniffing every corner, their tails wagging constant metronomes of canine optimism. She did a rapid calculation in her head that made her stomach clench with anxiety. 3 puppies meant food, veterinary care, space they did not have in this tiny trailer. It meant at least another $50 a week in expenses she could not afford, money that should go to feeding her children. It was irresponsible, impossible, and completely impractical to keep 3 dogs when they barely had enough resources to keep themselves alive. But as she looked at her sons' faces, at the desperate hope in their eyes, at the way Liam was holding Scout like the puppy was the only solid thing left in a world that had turned to quicksand beneath their feet, Sarah knew she could not take this away from them. These dogs were not pets. They were the last tangible connection to Daniel, the last proof that their father had loved them and thought about their happiness even in his final days. "We'll keep them," she heard herself say, and watched as relief flooded across 3 identical faces. "But boys, you have to understand this makes everything harder. We'll all have to be very careful with money and food. The puppies will need to be fed and taken care of, and that's going to be your responsibility. Can you do that?" The triplets nodded solemnly, and Sarah sank down onto the bed beside them, gathering her sons and 3 wiggling puppies into her arms. And for the first time since leaving the Brennan estate, she felt something that was not quite hope, but was perhaps its distant cousin, the knowledge that they were a family, complete and unbroken, and that somehow, against all logic and reason, they would find a way to survive. That night, after Rosa had brought armfuls of blankets and a box of groceries that Sarah accepted with tears of gratitude, after the boys and puppies had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep in a pile on the narrow bed, Sarah sat on the floor of the tiny trailer with her back against the cold aluminum wall and let herself remember Daniel Brennan as he truly was. Not the disappointing son his family had mourned, but the man she had loved with her whole heart. She had met him 7 years ago at Mountain View Elementary School, where she worked as a teacher's aide, struggling to finish her education degree at night while supporting herself during the day. He had arrived one morning in September with a crew to build new playground equipment, and while the other workers had been loud and crude, Daniel had been quiet and thoughtful, taking his lunch alone under a tree with a book, and when the children came out for recess, he had stopped his work to show them how the new slide would work, his face lighting up with genuine joy at their excitement. He had asked her out 3 times before she finally said yes. Convinced that a construction worker who read poetry and built playgrounds with such care could not possibly be serious about a girl who wore thrift store clothes and ate ramen for dinner most nights. Their first date had been a picnic in the mountains where he admitted the truth he had been hiding. He was Daniel Brennan, son of one of the wealthiest families in eastern Tennessee. But he had walked away from that world after college, unable to stomach the casual cruelty and obsession with status that defined his family. He had learned carpentry because he wanted to build things with his hands, to create something real and lasting, rather than shuffling papers in an office or collecting dividends from investments he did not understand. His family had been horrified, viewing his choice as a betrayal and an embarrassment, and when he told them he was marrying Sarah, a girl with no money and no connections, they had threatened to disown him entirely. Daniel had simply shrugged and said he had never wanted their money anyway, that he had enough in his own savings from his carpentry work to build them a good life, and that was all that mattered. They had married in a small ceremony with only Rosa and a few friends present, and for 5 beautiful years they had been happy in a way Sarah had never imagined possible, living in a modest rental house, working jobs they loved, and then welcoming the triplets into the world with joy that felt almost painful in its intensity. Daniel had been a wonderful father, patient and playful, teaching the boys to use tools almost before they could walk, reading to them every night, giving them those puppies just weeks before the accident. because he said every child deserved to know the loyalty of a good dog. He had died on a Tuesday afternoon when improperly secured steel beams had collapsed on a construction site, killing him instantly, and Sarah's world had ended in the space of a single phone call. The Brennans had swooped in immediately, taking control of everything, insisting Sarah and the boys move into the estate where they could be properly cared for, and Sarah, drowning in grief and terror about how she would support 3 infant sons alone, had agreed. Daniel had always told her not to worry, that he had made sure they would be taken care of, that he had plans and preparations, but Sarah had assumed he meant the modest life insurance policy from his employer and perhaps a small savings account, certainly nothing that would sustain them for long. She had never imagined he meant anything more, had never thought to question why his family was so insistent on controlling every aspect of their lives, and now, sitting in a freezing trailer with $17 left to her name, she wondered what Daniel had really meant by those promises, and whether somewhere in the rubble of her shattered life there was something she had missed, some piece of him that remained to guide her through the darkness ahead. 3 days after their arrival at the trailer, with the groceries Rosa had brought nearly gone and the reality of their situation settling like a weight on her chest, Sarah bundled the boys into their inadequate coats and drove the sputtering station wagon into the town of Ashford, a small mountain community of perhaps 3,000 souls where the Brennan name carried more weight than the law itself. She had circled ads in the local newspaper for waitressing positions, cashier work, anything that might bring in money, and she had left the puppies in Rosa's care with strict instructions and a promise to return before dark. The town sat in a valley surrounded by blue-shadowed mountains, its main street a collection of old brick buildings that had stood since the 1922nd, and as Sarah parked and helped the boys out of the car, she noticed how the few people on the sidewalk stopped their conversations to stare. She held her head high and took Ethan's hand while Noah and Liam flanked her on either side, and together they walked toward the first business on her list, a diner called Mountain Morning Cafe that had advertised for breakfast shift waitresses. Before she even reached the door, she saw the owner through the window, a heavy-set woman in her 50s, shake her head and point to a hastily written sign that had not been there in the newspaper ad. Position filled. Sarah's heart sank, but she pressed on to the next business, a hardware store that needed cashiers, only to be told by a manager who would not meet her eyes that they had decided to hire from within. At the pharmacy, the owner took one look at her and said they were no longer accepting applications. By the time they reached the grocery store, the 4th rejection in less than an hour, Liam was crying quietly and Noah was asking in a small voice why everyone was being so mean. Sarah knelt on the cold sidewalk and pulled them close, telling them it was not their fault, that sometimes grown-ups made unfair decisions, but she could see people watching from windows and doorways, their faces a mixture of pity and satisfaction, and she understood with devastating clarity that Margaret Brennan had already done her work. The family's influence reached into every business, every home, every conversation in this insular mountain town, and word had spread that Sarah was not to be helped, that she had been cast out for good reason, that decent people should keep their distance. The whispers followed them down the street, not even bothering to be subtle. That's the one. The gold digger who tried to trap Daniel Brennan heard she was after the family money all along. Poor Margaret, having to put up with her for so long. The triplets pressed closer to Sarah, their eyes downcast, and she felt a fury building in her chest that was almost frightening in its intensity. But she channeled it into determination, refusing to let these people see her break. They stopped finally at Frank's General Store, a small shop on the corner that sold everything from groceries to fishing supplies, and when they pushed through the door, a bell chimed overhead. The man behind the counter was ancient, perhaps 80 years old, with a weathered face and kind blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "Well now," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Haven't seen you folks in here before. Welcome." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple kindness in his tone, the first genuine warmth she had encountered all morning. She asked if he had any work available, any odd jobs or stocking positions, and though he shook his head sadly and explained he could barely afford to keep himself employed, he did something that restored a fragment of her faith in humanity. He reached into the jar of candy on the counter and pulled out 3 chocolate bars, handing one to each of the boys with a conspiratorial wink. "These are on the house," he said. "Every young man deserves something sweet now and then." As they left the store with Ethan, Noah, and Liam, clutching their unexpected treasures, Sarah looked back to see Frank watching them through the window, his expression troubled, and she knew that somewhere in this cold and judgmental town, there was at least one person who saw them not as pariahs, but as human beings worthy of basic kindness. Sarah was hanging laundry on a rope line Rosa had strung between two trees, trying to dry the boys' clothes after washing them in the trailer's tiny sink, when a sleek black sedan pulled up the rutted dirt road and stopped beside her station wagon. The car was expensive and out of place in the wilderness, its polished surface reflecting the gray December sky, and when the driver's door opened, a man in a dark suit emerged carrying a leather briefcase. He was perhaps 50 years old, with steel gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and everything about him spoke of professional competence and urban sophistication. Sarah's first thought was that the Brennans had sent someone to threaten her, perhaps a lawyer to demand she sign away rights to something, or papers relinquishing any claim to the family name, and she felt her body tense as he approached. "Mrs. Sarah Brennan?" he asked, his voice neutral and carefully professional. When she nodded warily, he extended a business card that read James Whitmore, a state attorney, with a Knoxville address and phone number. "I've been searching for you for 3 weeks. The Brennan estate refused to provide your current location, and the county had no forwarding address on file. I finally tracked you through a friend of yours, a Mrs. Rosa Martinez, who was kind enough to direct me here after I convinced her I meant you no harm." Sarah took the card, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them making sense. "I don't understand. I don't have an estate. I don't have anything." Whitmore glanced around at the dilapidated trailer, the clothesline, the visible poverty of her situation, and something like concern crossed his features. "Mrs. Brennan, I need to ask you a very specific question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Are you aware that your husband Daniel maintained a private safety deposit box?" The question was so unexpected, so completely outside anything Sarah had been anticipating, that she simply stared at him for a long moment. "A safety deposit box? No. Daniel and I had a joint checking account and a small savings account, but that's all. When he died, the Brennans took control of everything. They said there was barely anything left after the funeral expenses." Whitmore's expression shifted, becoming more intent. "The box was opened in Daniel's name alone 6 years ago, shortly after your marriage. I represent a trust that has been monitoring it, and according to our records, it has never been accessed except for the initial deposit. Mrs. Brennan, I have reason to believe that your husband placed something of significant value in that box, something that legally belongs to you and your children." Before Sarah could respond, before she could even begin to process what he was saying, Whitmore's gaze shifted to something behind her, and his entire demeanor changed. His face went pale, and his hand tightened on his briefcase. "Mrs. Brennan, don't turn around, but there's a black SUV parked on the main road about 200 yards down. It's been sitting there since I arrived. Do you recognize the vehicle?" Sarah's heart began to pound. She turned despite his warning and saw it, a large black SUV with tinted windows positioned where the dirt road met the paved county route, too far away to identify but close enough to be watching. "No, I've never seen it before." Whitmore pulled a phone from his pocket and took a photograph of the distant vehicle, his movements quick and nervous. "Mrs. Brennan, I need you to listen very carefully. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me. Your husband's family knows about the safety deposit box, and they have been actively working to prevent you from ever learning of its existence. That vehicle likely contains people they've hired to monitor you. I need to leave now before they identify me, but I'll contact you again soon at a safer location. In the meantime, tell no one about this conversation, especially not anyone connected to the Brennan family. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, her mouth dry, and watched as Whitmore climbed back into his sedan and drove away, leaving her standing beside a clothesline in the cold mountain air with more questions than answers, and the distinct feeling that her life had just become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. In the library of the Brennan estate, a room lined with leather-bound books that no one had read in decades, and furnished with antiques that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth, Margaret Brennan sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace while her son Richard paced before the flames like a caged predator. The report from their private investigator lay on the mahogany side table between them, a single page that confirmed their worst fear. Sarah had been located, and worse, she had been visited by an attorney from Knoxville. "This is your fault," Richard said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. I told you we should have handled this differently. We should have kept her here, kept her close where we could watch her. Throwing her out was reckless. Margaret's expression remained cold and composed, though her fingers tightened on the arms of her chair. We had no choice. She was becoming difficult, asking questions, demanding to see financial records. Last week she actually went into your father's study and started going through his files before I caught her. She was getting too close, and keeping her here was becoming more dangerous than letting her go. Our plan was sound. Cast her out with nothing, let her struggle and fail. And within 6 months, she would either have left the state entirely or become so desperate she would sign whatever we put in front of her in exchange for a few $1,000s. Richard stopped pacing and turned to face his buddy. Mother, his handsome features twisted with anxiety and greed. Except now, James Whitmore has found her. Do you understand what that means? He's the trustee. He's the one person who can tell her the truth about the inheritance. 30 years, Mother. 30 years we've been waiting for that money. Ever since Grandfather died and we learned he had left everything to Daniel instead of me. The golden boy, the favorite, the one who could do no wrong, even though he threw away every advantage our family gave him to play carpenter and marry some nobody from poverty. And now that he's finally dead, now that we should finally be able to claim what's rightfully ours, this becomes even more complicated. Margaret rose from her chair and moved to the window. Looking out over the snow-covered grounds that had been in the Brennan family for 4 generations, grounds that were mortgaged to the hilt because Richard had made spectacularly bad investments, and she had maintained appearances through 3 decades of increasingly desperate borrowing. Daniel was supposed to die without issue, she said quietly. When he married that girl, your father and I were beside ourselves. We knew about the trust, knew that if Daniel had children, the entire fortune would pass to them. We prayed the marriage would fail, that he would come to his senses, but then she got pregnant with triplets, and our window closed. When Daniel died in that accident, we thought perhaps God had given us one last chance. 3 infant boys and a grieving widow with no resources, no family, no strength to fight us. We brought them here not out of charity but out of strategy. We kept her dependent and desperate while we worked with our attorneys to find a way to break the trust, to prove Grandfather was mentally incompetent when he wrote it. Anything that would transfer the $100 million to the rightful heir. Richard returned to his pacing. And how is that working out? It's been 2 years and every legal avenue has failed. The trust is ironclad. The only way we get that money is if Sarah and those boys die or disappear completely, and even then the state would seize it before we could touch it. We need her signature on documents disclaiming the inheritance, claiming she's voluntarily walking away, but she has to do it before she learns what she's walking away from. That was the entire point of throwing her out, making her so desperate she would sign anything. Except now Whitmore has found her and he's going to tell her everything. Margaret turned from the window, her face set in hard lines. Then we need to move faster. Our investigator says she's living in squalor, barely surviving. We offer her $50,000 in exchange for signing away all claims to Daniel's estate. To a woman with nothing, $50,000 will seem like a fortune. She'll take it, and once she signs, the trust reverts to the family, and we can finally access what should have been ours all along. 2 days passed before James Whitmore returned, and this time he did not come alone. Sarah was inside the trailer trying to repair a leak in the roof with duct tape and prayers when she heard vehicles approaching. And when she looked out the grimy window, she saw Whitmore's black sedan followed by a county sheriff's patrol car. Her first instinct was fear, the bone-deep terror of someone who had been hunted and hurt. But when Whitmore emerged with a uniformed deputy at his side, his expression was apologetic but determined. Mrs. Brennan, I'm sorry for the dramatics, but after what I witnessed during my last visit, I felt it necessary to bring official protection. This is Deputy Marcus Chen from the Sevier County Sheriff's Department. He's aware of the situation and has agreed to serve as a witness and guardian while we discuss matters of significant legal importance. Sarah invited them into the cramped trailer where the triplets were doing homework at. The fold-down table, and Rosa, who had been helping watch the boys, quickly ushered them outside to play with the puppies, sensing this was a conversation not meant for young ears. Whitmore opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents, his movements precise and formal. Mrs. Brennan, I'm going to tell you something that will seem impossible, and I'm going to need you to sit down. Sarah remained standing, her arms crossed defensively. Just tell me. Whitmore took a breath and began. Your husband Daniel was the sole heir to a trust established by his grandfather, Thomas Brennan Sr., who made his fortune in industrial manufacturing and died 30 years ago. The trust was specifically structured to bypass Daniel's father and brother, whom the grandfather correctly assessed as financially irresponsible and morally bankrupt. The trust contains approximately $100 million in stocks, bonds, property, and liquid assets, and it was designed to transfer to Daniel on his 30th birthday or upon the birth of his first child, whichever came first. When your sons were born, Daniel became the legal beneficiary, and upon his death, the entire fortune passed to you and your children as his direct heirs. The words seemed to echo in the tiny space, each syllable landing like a physical blow. Sarah felt the room tilt and finally did sit down on the narrow bed, her legs no longer able to support her. That's impossible. Daniel worked construction. We lived in a rental house. We had maybe $5,000 in savings when he died. If he had $100 million, why would we have lived like that? Whitmore pulled out more documents, official papers with seals and signatures, because the trust had specific conditions. The funds were held in a managed account that Daniel could not access directly. Instead, he was required to maintain a private safety deposit box containing the complete trust documents and access instructions. The box is located at First National Bank in Chattanooga, and it can only be opened with a physical key that Daniel held. According to my records as the appointed trustee, Daniel visited that box exactly once, 6 years ago, shortly after your marriage. He deposited the trust documents and then, according to what he told me in our last conversation before his death, he hid the key somewhere safe, somewhere meaningful to you, Mrs. Brennan. Without that key, the trust remains locked and inaccessible. The Brennan family cannot touch it, but neither can you. Daniel told me that if anything happened to him, you would know where to find the key, that he had left you clues. Do you have any idea what he might have meant? Sarah's mind raced through memories, searching desperately for anything that might make sense, but there was nothing. No mysterious gift or cryptic message, no hidden compartment or secret conversation. I don't know, she whispered. I don't remember anything like that. Whitmore leaned forward, his expression grave. Then we have a serious problem, because the people in that black SUV, the people who work for your former in-laws, they're not going to stop watching you. They know about this money, Mrs. Brennan, and they will do whatever it takes to make sure you never find that key. The afternoon after Whitmore's devastating revelation, Sarah sat inside the trailer staring at the papers he had left behind, trying to make sense of $100 million she could not access and a key she could not remember, while outside the triplets played with Scout, Ranger, and Bear in the small clearing behind Rosa's property where a frozen creek wound through the trees. The boys had been subdued since the eviction, their usual energy dampened by fear and uncertainty, but the puppies had a way of pulling joy from even the darkest situations, and soon their laughter was echoing through the winter woods as they threw sticks and watched the dogs bound through the snow. Ethan had wandered farther than his brothers, following the creek upstream to where an enormous oak tree stood at the edge of the clearing, its bare branches reaching toward the gray sky like gnarled fingers, and Scout had followed him, sniffing at the base of the tree with unusual intensity. The puppy began to dig, his small paws working furiously at the frozen ground, and Ethan called to Noah and Liam to come see what Scout had found. The three boys knelt in the snow and helped the puppy dig, their fingers quickly going numb from the cold, but their curiosity driving them forward. And after several minutes of effort, Ethan's hand struck something solid buried about 8 inches down. They pulled it free together, a metal box no bigger than a shoebox, its surface covered in rust and dirt but still intact, and with trembling hands, Ethan pried open the lid that had been sealed with old wax. Inside, protected by layers of oilcloth, was a photograph and a piece of paper. The photograph showed the same oak tree they were standing under, but in summer when its branches were full and green, and standing beside the trunk with his arm around it like an old friend was their father. Looking younger and happier than the boys clearly remembered, his smile bright and his eyes full of life. On the back of the photograph, in their father's distinctive handwriting, was a date from 7 years ago and the words, "For Sarah, when she needs to remember." The paper was a note, written on the same kind of lined notebook paper Daniel had always used for his carpentry sketches, and the boys carried both items inside to their mother, bursting through the trailer door with excitement and cold reddened cheeks. Sarah took the photograph with shaking hands, tears immediately springing to her eyes at the sight of Daniel's face, and when she turned it over and saw his handwriting, a sob caught in her throat. She unfolded the note carefully, smoothing the creases, and read the words he had written in his familiar script. Where three streams meet, the foundation holds the key to our future. Trust in what we built together. The place where I asked you to marry me holds everything you need. Love always, D. The words were cryptic but somehow familiar, tickling at the edges of a memory Sarah could not quite grasp, and she stared at the photograph again, trying to place when and where it had been taken. Ethan was asking if they had done something good, if this helped, and Sarah pulled all three boys into a fierce embrace, telling them yes, they had done something wonderful. They had found a message from their daddy that might change everything. As she held her sons and studied the photograph and the note, Sarah's mind began to work backward through the years, searching for the moment Daniel had taken this picture, searching for a place where three streams met and where he had built something with his own hands. And slowly, like dawn breaking over mountains, the memory began to surface, distant and precious, of a day 7 years ago when Daniel had brought her to a secret place in the wilderness and asked her to be his wife. Sarah sat on the edge of the narrow bed with the photograph in her hands, staring at the oak tree and her husband's smiling face, and suddenly the memory crashed over her with such clarity it took her breath away. It had been early in their relationship, perhaps 3 months after they had started dating, when Daniel had told her he wanted to show her something special, a place that belonged only to him. They had driven for hours into the deepest part of the Smoky Mountains, far beyond the tourist trails and marked roads, until they reached a barely visible track that wound through dense forest. He had parked at the end of the track and led her on foot for another mile through wilderness so remote it felt like they had stepped back in time to an era before humans had touched these mountains. The cabin had appeared suddenly in a small clearing, a simple structure of weathered logs that Daniel explained he had built himself over several summers when he needed to escape his family's suffocating expectations and constant criticism. It sat in an extraordinary location where 3 separate mountain streams converged into a single rushing flow, the sound of the water a constant music that filled the air. He had brought her inside and shown her his workshop, the place where he crafted furniture and carved wood, where he kept his books and his dreams. And it was there, standing in the golden afternoon light that filtered through the small windows, that he had asked her to marry him. Sarah realized with a jolt that she had not thought about that cabin in years, had not returned to it even once after their marriage, because life had become busy with teaching and then pregnancy and then the overwhelming chaos of raising triplets. After Daniel's death, the memory had been too painful to revisit, and she had pushed it deep into the locked rooms of her grief where it could not hurt her. But now she understood that Daniel had chosen that place deliberately, had hidden something there in the foundation just as his note indicated, something that would lead her to the key and the safety deposit box, and the fortune that could save her children. She pulled out the road atlas she kept in the station wagon and spread it across the table, tracing routes with her finger while the boys watched with wide eyes. The cabin was located in a remote section of the Cherokee National Forest, at least 3 hours from their current location by car, and then another significant distance on foot. Under normal circumstances, it would be a challenging hike, but in December, with snow on the ground and temperatures dropping below freezing at night, it would be dangerous, potentially deadly if they encountered a storm or if the old logging roads were impassable. Rosa, who had come in to see what the excitement was about, looked at the map and shook her head with worry. "Mija, you cannot take those boys into the mountains in winter. It's too dangerous. Wait until spring when the weather is better." But Sarah knew they could not wait. Whitmore had warned her that the Brennans were watching, waiting for their opportunity, and if they discovered what she was searching for, they would get there first. More importantly, they were running out of money. The $500 from the glove compartment was nearly gone, spent on gasoline and the few groceries Rosa had not been able to provide. They had perhaps enough for another week, maybe 2 if they ate nothing but rice and beans, and then they would have nothing. The key was out there waiting in a place Daniel had chosen specifically because it meant something to both of them. And every day she delayed was another day closer to complete destitution. Another day the boys went to bed hungry. Another day the Brennans tightened their net around her. She looked at Ethan, Noah, and Liam, at their thin faces and worn clothes, at the hope in their eyes that their discovery had mattered. And she made her decision. They would leave at dawn, and they would find whatever Daniel had left for them in that distant cabin, or they would die trying. Sarah called James Whitmore that evening from Rosa's telephone. and told him about the photograph and the note, about the cabin where three streams met, and her certainty that Daniel had hidden something crucial there. Whitmore's response was immediate and forceful. "Do not go. Wait for him to arrange proper security. The winter mountains were treacherous, and the Brennans had resources she could not imagine." But Sarah explained what he already knew in his heart, that waiting meant starving, that every day brought them closer to complete collapse, and that if the Brennans discovered the cabin's location before she could reach it, everything would be lost. There was a long silence on the line before Whitmore finally agreed, his voice heavy with resignation and worry. He said he would drive out immediately and provide what help he could, and he arrived near midnight with a satellite phone in a hardened case, explaining that cell service would be non-existent in the remote mountains, but the satellite connection would work anywhere. He made her promise to call him every 12 hours without fail, and if she missed even one check-in, he would contact the authorities and send search and rescue teams. He also delivered grimmer news. His contacts had confirmed that Richard Brennan had hired a private investigation firm with a reputation for operating in moral gray areas, and they had been watching the trailer constantly, documenting her movements and likely tapping into any communications they could access. Whitmore handed her an envelope containing $500 in cash. Money, he said, came from a discretionary fund he controlled as trustee, and he told her to be careful, to trust no one, and to remember that the Brennans were desperate people who had already demonstrated they would stop at nothing to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Rosa spent the hours before dawn preparing supplies with the frantic energy of a grandmother sending her grandchildren into war. She loaded her old 1987 Ford pickup truck with sleeping bags, a canvas tent, a camp stove, canned food, bottled water, rope, a first aid kit, flashlights, and every warm piece of clothing she could find in her house. She pressed her own heavy wool coat into Sarah's hands and insisted she take it, and she knelt before the triplets and made them promise to listen to their mother and stay together no matter what happened. The boys were frightened but also excited, sensing they were embarking on something important, an adventure that might lead them out of the cold poverty of the trailer and into something better. They loaded Scout, Ranger, and Bear into the truck's covered bed, creating a nest of blankets where the puppies could stay warm, and the dogs seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, staying unusually calm and close to the boys instead of bounding around with their typical puppy energy. As the first gray light of dawn touched the mountain peaks, Sarah hugged Rosa goodbye and climbed into the driver's seat of the pickup while Ethan, Noah, and Liam squeezed together in the passenger side. She started the engine, which turned over with a reassuring rumble that was far more reliable than her dying station wagon, and pulled out onto the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, she could see Rosa standing in her driveway, her hand raised in farewell or perhaps blessing, and beyond her on the main road, barely visible in the early morning gloom, the black SUV that had been watching them pulled out and began to follow at a careful distance. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter and pressed the accelerator, and behind her in the truck bed, 3 golden puppies stood watch over the supplies that would keep her family alive in the wilderness, their young faces serious and alert, as if they knew their boys were heading into danger and they would be needed before this journey was through. The first 2 hours of driving went smoothly as Sarah followed the route she remembered from 7 years ago, winding deeper into the mountains on paved roads that gradually turned to gravel and then to dirt. The black SUV followed at a distance, sometimes disappearing around curves but always reappearing, a constant predatory presence that made Sarah's hands sweat despite the cold. She pushed the old pickup as fast as she dared on the deteriorating roads, the boys bouncing in their seat and the puppies scrambling for purchase in the truck bed, until finally she reached the turnoff Daniel had used, a barely visible track that led into dense forest. The track was passable for the first mile, the truck's sturdy frame handling the ruts and rocks, but then they rounded a bend, and Sarah's heart sank. A massive fallen pine tree lay across the path, and beyond it, the road was buried under snowdrifts that reached nearly to the truck's hood. There was no way forward except on foot. She explained the situation to the boys as calmly as she could, and together they unloaded the essential supplies, packing them into backpacks and bags they could carry. Sarah took the heaviest load, the tent and food and water, while she distributed lighter items among the triplets, and they fashioned makeshift leashes for the puppies from rope, though the dogs stayed so close to the boys they hardly needed restraining. The hike began in relative quiet, the forest hushed under its blanket of snow, but within the first mile Sarah understood how brutal this journey would be. The snow was knee-deep on the boys, and every step required enormous effort as they lifted their legs high and plunged them down again, their breath coming in gasps of exertion and cold. Scout, Ranger, and Bear instinctively began breaking trail, their larger bodies and four-legged stability allowing them to push through the drifts more easily than the humans. And the boys followed in the paths the puppies created, encouraging each other with words that broke Sarah's heart. "Come on, Liam, you can do it. Just a little farther. Noah, grab my hand. I'll help you over this part. Ethan, wait for us. Don't go too fast." They had covered perhaps 3 miles when disaster struck at a frozen stream crossing. The creek was shallow but wide, its surface covered in ice that looked solid but was treacherous underneath. Sarah tested it carefully and declared it safe, and they began to cross single file with her leading the way. They were almost to the other side when the ice beneath Noah's feet suddenly cracked with a sound like a gunshot. He plunged through up to his thigh, his leg disappearing into the frigid water below, and when Sarah and his brothers pulled him free, he was sobbing not just from cold but from pain. His ankle had twisted badly when he fell, already beginning to swell inside his wet boot. Sarah wanted to turn back, to abandon this impossible quest and get Noah to safety. But they were 3 miles from the truck and 2 miles from the cabin, and the boy insisted through his tears that he could keep going, that he did not want to be the reason they failed. His brothers supported him on either side, forming a human crutch, and they pressed forward as darkness began to fall. That night they made camp in a small depression sheltered by overhanging rocks, and Sarah erected the tent with numb fingers while the boys huddled together with the puppies, all 6 young creatures forming a pile of shared warmth. She heated canned soup on the camp stove and they ate in silence, too exhausted for conversation, and when they finally crawled into the tent and zipped themselves into sleeping bags, Sarah lay awake listening to the wind howl through the trees and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake that would cost her children their lives. Sarah had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep when Scout's barking jolted her awake, a sound of alarm that cut through the night like a siren. The puppy was at the tent entrance, his body rigid and his barks continuous and frantic, the kind of warning that meant genuine danger, not just a curious raccoon or nightbird. Sarah scrambled out of her sleeping bag and unzipped the tent flap, peering into the darkness beyond their small campsite, where the fire had burned down to glowing embers. At first, she saw nothing but the black shapes of trees and the pale gleam of snow under a quarter moon that had emerged from behind the clouds. Then she saw them, 3 distinct points of light moving through the forest, perhaps half a mile below their position, flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the snow as whoever carried them followed the trail. Sarah and the boys had broken through the drifts. Her blood went cold as she understood what she was seeing. The men from the black SUV had not given up when she drove beyond where their vehicle could follow. They had come on foot, tracking her family through the wilderness, and now they were closing the distance with the steady determination of hunters who knew their prey was exhausted and vulnerable. Ranger and Bear had joined Scout now, all 3 puppies growling low in their throats, and the commotion had woken the triplets who emerged from their sleeping bags with frightened questions. "Mom, what's wrong? Who's out there?" Sarah's mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. They could stay and confront whoever was following them, but she had no weapons and no way to defend 3 small boys against grown men who were clearly willing to trek through a winter forest in the middle of the night. They could try to hide, but their tracks in the snow led directly to this campsite like a painted arrow. The only choice that gave them any chance at all was to run, to use the few miles of distance still between them and their pursuers to reach the cabin first. She made the decision in seconds, her voice quiet but commanding as she told the boys to get dressed immediately, to put on every layer they had, that they were leaving right now. "But Mom, it's dark. We can't hike in the dark. What about Noah's ankle?" Ethan's practical concerns were valid, but Sarah had moved beyond practical into the realm of pure survival instinct. She explained in simple terms that bad men were following them, men who wanted to take away something that belonged to their family. And if they did not reach the cabin first, everything their father had tried to protect would be lost. The boys dressed with remarkable speed, their fear transforming into determination, and Sarah broke camp in under 10 minutes, stuffing gear into packs with shaking hands. Noah insisted he could walk despite his swollen ankle, and his brothers took up their positions on either side of him, ready to support his weight. The moon provided enough light to see the trail ahead, and the puppies, sensing the urgency, moved forward with purpose rather than the wandering curiosity typical of their age. Sarah took one last look at the distant flashlight beams, now perhaps only a quarter-mile away and moving faster, then turned and led her small family deeper into the mountain darkness, trusting that Scout, Ranger, and Bear would guide them true, and that somewhere ahead in the cold December night, Daniel's cabin waited with the answers that would save them all. The first rays of dawn broke over the mountain peaks just as Sarah and her exhausted family emerged from a thick stand of pine trees and saw it. The cabin exactly where her memory had placed it, in a small clearing where 3 separate mountain streams tumbled down from different directions and merged into a single crystalline pool that even in December had not completely centers. Frozen. The sound of the rushing water was exactly as she remembered, a constant music that had provided the soundtrack to Daniel's proposal 7 years ago. And the cabin itself stood weathered but intact, its log walls gray with age but still solid, its small stone chimney rising straight and true against the pale morning sky. The boys stumbled forward on legs that could barely support them after hiking through the night, and even the puppies moved slowly now, their boundless energy finally depleted by hours of breaking trail through deep snow. Sarah's hands shook as she approached the door, half expecting it to be locked, but when she pushed, it swung open on hinges that groaned but held, and they all tumbled inside out of the bitter cold into air that was only marginally warmer, but felt like sanctuary simply because it blocked the wind. The interior was a single room, perhaps 15 feet square, and it was like stepping into a photograph, a perfect preservation of the man Daniel had been before marriage and fatherhood and death. His workbench still stood against the far wall, covered with hand tools arranged in precise order, chisels and planes and saws that looked as if he had just set them down moments ago. Sketches and drawings covered one wall, designs for furniture and cabinets rendered in his careful architectural hand, and in the corner, a small wood stove sat cold and dark, but ready to provide warmth if they could find fuel. The boys moved through the space with reverent wonder, touching their father's tools with gentle fingers, and Liam found a wooden box on a shelf that contained small carved animals Daniel had made. A deer and a fox and a bear, each one smooth and perfect and clearly crafted with love. Sarah stood in the center of the room, fighting tears, remembering the afternoon Daniel had brought her here, how he had shown her this space and told her it represented his dreams of a life built with his own hands, simple and honest and free from his family's corruption, and how he had asked her to share that life with him. But there was no time for grief or nostalgia, because somewhere behind them in the forest, perhaps an hour away or perhaps less, men were still following their trail, and they had not come this far to fail now. The note had said the foundation held the key to their future, and Sarah moved to the stone hearth, running her hands over the rocks, looking for anything that seemed loose or out of place. The boys joined her, and even the puppies seemed to understand this was important, sniffing at the base of the fireplace with unusual focus. They searched for 20 minutes, examining every stone, every crack, every possible hiding place, but found nothing, and Sarah felt despair beginning to creep in until Noah, sitting on the floor because his ankle could no longer support his weight, said in a small voice that maybe they were thinking about foundation wrong, that maybe Daddy meant the actual foundation under the cabin, not just the fireplace. And suddenly Sarah understood with perfect clarity what Daniel had done and where they needed to look. Sarah was about to crawl outside to examine the cabin's exterior foundation when Scout suddenly froze in the middle of the room, his body going rigid and his ears perking forward. Within seconds, Ranger and Bear had joined him, and all 3 puppies converged on the same spot near the base of the stone fireplace, not at the hearth itself, but at the wide, flat stones that formed the floor immediately in front of it. They began scratching with their paws, whining with an urgency that was eerily similar to how Scout had behaved when he found the buried metal box back at Rosa's property, and Sarah felt her heart begin to race as she knelt beside them. The floor stones were large slabs of slate, each one fitted carefully against its neighbors, and at first glance they all appeared identical and immovable. But as Sarah ran her fingers along the edges of the stone where the puppies were most focused, she felt something different, a gap that was slightly wider than the others, and when she pressed down on one corner, the opposite corner lifted ever so slightly. She looked at Ethan, Noah, and Liam, their faces pale with exhaustion and hope, and together they worked their fingers into the gap and lifted. The stone was heavy, requiring all 4 of them pulling together to raise it high enough to slide it aside, and when they finally moved it, they revealed a hollow space beneath, a deliberately constructed hiding place carved into the earth and lined with stone to keep it dry. Inside was a single object wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth and sealed with wax that had kept it protected for 7 years. Sarah lifted it out with trembling hands and carefully peeled away the protective layers until she held a waterproof container, the kind used by hikers and campers to protect valuables from the elements. The lid came off with a soft pop, and inside, nestled in foam padding, were 3 items that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The first was a brass key, small and elegant, with a numbered tag attached that read First National Bank Chattanooga and a box number. The second was a letter, pages of Daniel's handwriting on his familiar notebook paper, folded carefully and addressed to Sarah in his strong, clear script. The third was a silver locket on a delicate chain, and when Sarah opened it with shaking fingers, she saw 3 tiny photographs, each one showing a newborn baby with Daniel's features. The triplets on the day they were born. She could not read the letter immediately because tears were streaming down her face, and the boys crowded close, asking what it said, what Daddy had written, and she had to wipe her eyes several times before she could focus on the words. Daniel's letter began with an apology for the secrecy and confusion, explaining that he had learned about the trust from his grandfather's attorney shortly after their wedding, $100 million inheritance that his father and brother knew about and had been waiting decades to claim. He wrote about how he had been terrified of what his family would do if they discovered Sarah and any children were the legal heirs, how he had seen the cruelty and greed they were capable of, and how he had made the decision to hide the trust documents and key in a place only Sarah would be able to find by following clues he had left behind. He explained that the cabin represented their beginning, the place where they had promised to build a life together, and that the foundation of that promise was love and trust, which was why he had literally hidden the key in the foundation. The letter went on for several pages, detailing his hopes and dreams for their sons, his pride in the family they had created, and his absolute certainty that if something happened to him, Sarah would be strong enough to protect their boys from his family's poison. The final paragraph was almost impossible to read through her tears. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am so sorry I cannot be there to watch our sons grow into men. But you have everything you need now to give them the life they deserve, free from my family's control and cruelty. Use this money not to buy things, but to buy freedom, safety, and the space to heal. Teach our boys that wealth without kindness is poverty, that family is who stands beside you in darkness, and that their father loved them more than all the gold in all the mountains in all the world. And Sarah clutched the letter to her chest while her sons pressed against her, and the 3 puppies who had led them to this moment sat watching with their intelligent eyes, as if they too understood that something profound and world-changing had just occurred in this small cabin, where 3 streams met, and a good man's love had finally brought his family home. Sarah was reading the final lines of Daniel's letter aloud to the boys, her voice breaking with emotion as she explained what their father had done to protect them. When the cabin door burst open with such force, it slammed against the wall, and 3 figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning snow. Richard Brennan stood in the center, his expensive outdoor gear pristine despite the trek through the wilderness, flanked by 2 large men in dark tactical clothing who looked like they had stepped out of a military contractor catalog. Richard's face was flushed with cold and fury, his breath coming in heavy gasps from the hike, but his eyes were locked on the brass key that lay on the floor beside Sarah, with an expression of naked greed that made her stomach turn. I knew you would lead us right to it, he said, stepping into the cabin while his hired men fanned out to block any escape route. We've been following you since you left that pathetic trailer. Did you really think you could hide from us, that you could steal what belongs to this family? Sarah stood slowly, placing herself between Richard and her sons, the key now clutched in her hand. This doesn't belong to you. Your grandfather made sure of that. He knew exactly what you were. And he chose to give everything to Daniel because Daniel was the only decent person in your entire family. Richard's face darkened, and he took another step forward, his voice rising. Daniel was a fool who threw away every advantage he was given to play carpenter and marry a girl from the gutter. That money should have been mine. I'm the eldest son. I'm the one who stayed and worked for the family business while Daniel ran away to build his little shacks and pretend he was better than us. And now he's dead, and you, some nobody, some gold digger who trapped him with a pregnancy, you think you have the right to $100 million that's been in my family for 3 generations. The hired men moved closer, and Sarah saw one of them had his hand on what looked like a holster under his jacket. She held the key tighter, her mind racing for options. but they were trapped in a single-room cabin with 3 grown men blocking the only door. Richard extended his hand, his voice dropping to a cold, controlled tone that was somehow more frightening than his shouting. "Give me the key, Sarah. We can do this the easy way. I'll give you $50,000, enough to start over somewhere far from here, and you sign papers saying you relinquish all claims to Daniel's estate. Or we can do this the hard way, and I promise you don't want that. Those boys of yours, they could have accidents. Children disappear in these mountains all the time. It was the threat against her sons that shattered Sarah's paralysis, and she stepped backward toward the workbench where Daniel's tools lay, her hand reaching for anything she could use as a weapon. But before she could grab the heavy hammer, Richard lunged forward and seized her wrist, his grip bruisingly tight as he tried to pry her fingers open to take the key. In that instant, 3 things happened simultaneously. Ethan screamed for his mother, Scout let out a sound that was not a bark but a roar, and 6 months of loyalty and love transformed 3 puppies into defenders. Scout hit Richard in the back of the knees like a furry missile, his teeth finding purchase on the man's expensive snow pants, while Ranger launched himself at one of the hired men, snarling and snapping at his hands when he reached for his weapon, and Bear, the largest of the 3, placed himself directly in front of Noah and Liam and showed teeth that were no longer puppy small, but the genuine fangs of a young dog who would die before letting anyone harm his boys. Richard released Sarah's wrist with a cry of pain and shock as Scout's teeth found skin, and in the chaos of 3 dogs attacking, 3 boys screaming, and 2 hired men trying to defend themselves without shooting a puppy and creating witnesses to murder, Sarah made her choice and grabbed Ethan's hand and yelled for Noah and Liam to follow, and ran not for the blocked front door but for the small back window of the cabin that she prayed was still large enough for them all to fit through. Sarah threw herself through the back window first, landing hard in the snow outside and rolling to absorb the impact before turning to catch Ethan as he came through. Then Noah, despite his injured ankle, and finally Liam. While inside the cabin the sounds of chaos continued, with dogs snarling and men cursing and furniture crashing. The 3 puppies came through the window, one after another in graceful leaps, and then Sarah was running with her sons stumbling behind her, plunging into the forest on the far side of the cabin where the 3 streams converged into increasingly wild terrain. Behind them she heard Richard screaming orders to his men, heard the crash as they abandoned trying to control the dogs and simply smashed through the window in pursuit. And she knew they had perhaps seconds before bullets started flying, regardless of witnesses or consequences. Scout took the lead without any command, his nose to the ground and his body moving with purpose along the bank of the largest stream where the terrain was rocky and treacherous but the snow was thinner. Ranger stayed with the boys, nipping at their heels when they slowed, encouraging them forward with the same instinct that made his ancestors herd sheep across mountains, and Bear brought up the rear, constantly looking back toward their pursuers with his lips pulled back from his teeth. The path Scout chose was barely a path at all, more of a game trail that wound along the stream bank where exposed rocks provided uncertain footing and ice-slicked boulders forced them to climb and scramble. Noah was crying with pain, his twisted ankles screaming with every step, but his brothers pulled him forward, and Sarah lifted him over obstacles, and somehow they kept moving even as the shouts behind them grew closer. They had covered perhaps half a mile when the stream dropped away into a ravine, a deep cut in the mountain where the water plunged 30 feet down in a waterfall that in summer would be spectacular, but in December was a partially frozen cascade of ice and mist. The ravine was perhaps 15 feet across, and spanning it at the narrowest point was a natural bridge formed by a fallen tree that had been coated in ice and snow, creating a treacherous pathway to the other side. Scout did not hesitate, trotting across the icy log with the sure-footedness of a creature whose survival depended on trusting his instincts, and Ranger followed. But when Ethan started to cross, Sarah grabbed him back, her heart in her throat at the sight of that narrow, slippery span with nothing but rocks and rushing water below. They had no choice because Richard and his men were crashing through the brush behind them, close enough now that she could hear their individual voices, and she helped Ethan onto the log, telling him to go slowly, to stay low, to keep his eyes on Scout, who was already safely across. Noah went next, his brothers holding his hands until he was far enough out that they had to let go, and Sarah's heart stopped at every wobbling step, but the boy made it across and collapsed on the far side. Liam followed with Ranger beside him, moving in perfect synchronization, and then Sarah started across, her arms extended for balance and her boots finding precarious purchase on the ice-covered bark. She was halfway when Bear, who had been watching the trail behind them, suddenly turned and charged back toward their pursuers, barking with a ferocity that seemed impossible from a 6-month-old puppy. Richard Brennan burst from the trees first, saw Sarah on the bridge, and without thinking of consequences or physics, he ran forward and started across. Sarah reached the far side and turned just in time to see what happened next. Richard's weight, twice that of the children who had crossed before him, combined with his momentum and the inherent instability of the ice-coated log, created a situation that physics resolved with brutal efficiency. The ice cracked with a sound like breaking glass. Richard's feet slipped, and he went down hard on his stomach, his hands scrabbling for purchase as the log shifted and began to roll. And suddenly he was hanging by his fingertips over a 30-foot drop onto rocks, while his hired men on the opposite bank reached for him, and Scout barked triumphantly, and Sarah grabbed her sons and ran deeper into the Passapoit wilderness, knowing they had just bought themselves time, but understanding that eventually someone would cross that ravine and the chase would continue. Sarah had no idea how long they had been running when Liam simply stopped moving, his small body swaying and his eyes unfocused. And when she touched his face, his skin was ice cold, and his lips had taken on a bluish tinge that sent terror shooting through her veins. Hypothermia was setting in, and Noah was not much better, shivering violently and mumbling incoherently about being tired and wanting to sleep. And even Ethan, who had been the strongest, was stumbling and falling every few steps. The puppies pressed close against the boys, trying to share what warmth they had, but it was not enough. And Sarah understood with horrible clarity that they had perhaps minutes before her sons began to die from exposure. She was carrying Liam now, his weight almost more than she could bear, while Ethan and Noah leaned on each other and moved with mechanical determination. When they broke through a line of trees and found themselves on a cleared trail, an actual maintained Forest Service path that had been recently packed down by vehicles, Sarah wanted to weep with relief, but she had no tears left and no time because she could still hear sounds of pursuit somewhere behind them. Richard's men having found a way across the ravine. She turned right on the trail, heading downhill because that was where help would be if help existed, and they had covered perhaps 200 yards when a green Forest Service truck appeared around a bend, moving slowly as its driver checked the trail conditions. The truck stopped when the driver saw them, and a man in his 30s with dark hair and a ranger's uniform jumped out, his expression transforming from curiosity to alarm as he took in the scene before him. A woman barely standing, 3 small boys in various stages of hypothermia, and 3 young dogs who looked like they had been through a war. "Jesus, how long have you been out here?" he asked, already moving toward them and pulling a thermal blanket from his truck. "I'm Ranger Marcus Webb. You're in serious trouble. These kids need warming now," Sarah tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of exhaustion and fear. And Webb did not waste time asking questions, but instead began loading the boys into his truck's heated cab, wrapping them in emergency blankets, and cranking the heat to maximum. He was checking Noah's ankle and talking calmly to the children about staying awake when the sound of breaking brush announced the arrival of Richard's 2 hired men, who burst onto the trail 50 yards away and stopped when they saw the ranger's truck. Webb's entire demeanor changed in an instant, his body language shifting from caregiver to something far more dangerous, and Sarah saw recognition in his movements, the fluid economy of motion that came from military training. He stepped away from the truck and positioned himself directly in the center of the trail, his hand moving to the radio on his belt. "That's far enough, gentlemen," he called out, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "I'm Ranger Webb, and you're going to stay right where you are while I figure out what's going on here." One of the men, the larger of the 2, took a step forward. "Those people stole property that belongs to our employer. We're just trying to get it back." Webb did not move, did not even blink, and something in his stillness made the man stop advancing. "I'm a veteran, did 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and I learned to recognize predators when I see them. You're not getting past me, and if you try, you're going to discover that park rangers are federal law enforcement officers with full arrest authority, and I'm armed. Now, I'm going to call for backup, and we're all going to wait here nice and calm until the sheriff arrives. And then we'll sort out who stole what from whom." He keyed his radio without taking his eyes off the men, and requested immediate assistance, giving his location and describing a situation involving possible child endangerment and assault. The 2 hired men exchanged glances, clearly calculating odds and consequences, and apparently decided that whatever Richard Brennan was paying them was not worth fighting a federal officer. And they began backing slowly up the trail while Webb stood his ground like a wall between them and the truck where Sarah held her sons and felt safety wrap around them for the first time in days. Ranger Webb drove them down the mountain to the nearest hospital where the triplets were treated for mild hypothermia and frostbite. Noah's ankle was wrapped and elevated, and Sarah was given hot coffee and a blanket and told by 3 different nurses that she was incredibly lucky her children were not in critical condition. James Whitmore arrived within 2 hours of her satellite phone call, his face gray with worry and relief, and he brought with him news both good and terrible. The good news was that Richard Brennan had been arrested by county sheriff's deputies after Webb's report detailed the pursuit through the wilderness and the threats against children, and he was currently being held on charges of reckless endangerment and attempted assault. The terrible news was that Richard had made phone calls from the sheriff's station using his one allowed contact to reach a high-powered attorney in Knoxville. And by noon the following day an emergency motion had been filed in family court, claiming that Sarah Brennan was mentally unstable, had dragged 3 minor children into a frozen wilderness on a delusional treasure hunt, and represented a clear danger to their welfare. The motion requested immediate temporary guardianship of Ethan, Noah, and Liam be granted to their uncle Richard as their closest responsible adult relative, and because Richard's attorney had connections to a judge who owed the Brennan family favors, the motion was scheduled for an emergency hearing in 36 hours. Whitmore explained all of this in the hospital corridor while keeping his voice low and controlled, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes because he understood what she was only beginning to grasp. If that guardianship was granted, even temporarily, Richard would have legal control over the boys and could make decisions about their medical care, their education, and most importantly, their financial inheritance. He could appoint himself as guardian of their trust and effectively control the $100 million until they turned 18, by which time he would have found ways to drain it or hide it or tie it up in legal knots that would take decades to untangle. Their only option was to reach the bank in Chattanooga, access the safety deposit box with Daniel's key, retrieve the trust documents, and file them with the probate court before Richard's hearing, establishing beyond any legal doubt that Sarah and her sons were the rightful heirs, and that any guardianship motion was a transparent attempt at theft. The problem was that Chattanooga was 4 hours away. The bank closed at 3 in the afternoon, and Richard's attorneys were almost certainly monitoring Sarah's movements and would attempt to delay or prevent her from reaching the bank through legal injunctions or physical interference. Whitmore made the decision that likely saved everything. He arranged for a private security firm to provide transport, 2 armed former police officers who drove a nondescript SUV with tinted windows, and at dawn the next morning they smuggled Sarah and the boys out of the hospital through a service entrance, while Whitmore walked out the front door carrying bags and acting as a decoy. The drive to Chattanooga was the longest 4 hours of Sarah's life. Watching the clock tick toward 3 while the boys dozed in their seats, and the security officers maintained constant communication with Whitmore, who was running interference and monitoring any legal filings that might stop them. They arrived at First National Bank at 2:15, and Sarah walked through the marble lobby with the brass key clutched in her hand, Whitmore at her side, the boys holding hands behind her, and Scout, Ranger, and Bear on their leashes because after everything those puppies had done to save them, Sarah refused to leave them in a vehicle. The bank manager looked at the key and the number on its tag and led them to the vault, a massive steel door that swung open to reveal rows of safety deposit boxes lining the walls. And when he inserted his master key and Sarah inserted Daniel's key and they turned them together, the small door clicked open and Sarah reached inside to retrieve what her husband had hidden 7 years ago, knowing that in her hands she now held either salvation or the fuel for a legal war that would consume whatever remained of her shattered life. The safety deposit box was larger than Sarah had expected, perhaps 2 feet long and a foot deep, and as she slid it from its slot in the vault wall, she felt the weight of its contents, the physical manifestation of Daniel's promises and his grandfather's legacy. Whitmore had arranged for 2 Chattanooga sheriff's deputies to be present, standing guard at the vault entrance in case Richard's people attempted any last-minute interference, and the bank manager hovered nervously nearby while the triplets pressed close to their mother, their eyes wide with exhaustion and anticipation. Sarah carried the box to a private viewing room and set it on the polished wooden table, and with trembling fingers she lifted the lid. Inside, Organized with Daniel's characteristic precision were layers of documents protected by archival folders and sealed plastic sleeves. The first folder contained the original trust document, 30 pages of legal language typed on heavy paper and bearing the signature of Thomas Brennan Sr., along with notary seals and witness statements dated 30 years ago. Whitmore took the document with reverent care and began reading, his eyes moving rapidly across the text, and after several minutes, he looked up at Sarah with an expression of wonder. "This is extraordinary." The trust was established with an initial funding of $40 million in 1995, and it's been professionally managed and growing ever since. According to these quarterly statements, the current value is just over $107 million in a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings. Thomas Sr.'s instructions are absolutely explicit. The trust passes to Daniel Brennan upon his 30th birthday, or upon the birth of his first child, whichever comes first. And upon Daniel's death, it transfers in full to his spouse and direct descendants. There are no provisions for collateral relatives. Richard has zero claim to any of this. Sarah pulled out the next layer and found stock certificates from major corporations, deeds to commercial properties in 3 states, and a ledger documenting every transaction and distribution over 3 decades of careful financial stewardship. There was also another letter from Daniel, this one written in the weeks before his death, and Sarah's hands shook as she unfolded the pages. Her husband's words explained that his grandfather had been a hard man but a perceptive one, who had watched his own son and eldest grandson Richard grow into entitled, cruel people who viewed wealth as a weapon and other humans as obstacles to be crushed or purchased. The old man had despised what they represented and had made the deliberate choice to skip a generation, to place his fortune in the hands of Daniel, whom he recognized as fundamentally different, and to structure the trust in such a way that Richard and his father could never touch it. Daniel wrote that his grandfather had told him shortly before his death that real wealth was not measured in dollars but in the quality of the family you built, the kindness you showed to those with less power, and the legacy of decency you left behind, and that he trusted Daniel to use this money not to build monuments to himself, but to create safety and opportunity for those he loved. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in blue ribbon, were 3 sealed envelopes, each one bearing a name in Daniel's handwriting. For Ethan, to be opened on your 18th birthday. For Noah, to be opened on your 18th birthday. For Liam, to be opened on your 18th birthday. Sarah held them with infinite care and handed one to each of her sons, explaining that these were final gifts from their father, words he had written specifically for them to read when they became men, and the boys clutched their envelopes like sacred relics while tears streamed down their faces. Whitmore was already on his phone, photographing documents and sending them to his office with instructions to file them immediately with the probate court and to prepare an emergency motion to dismiss Richard's guardianship petition. And as Sarah sat, surrounded by papers worth more than she could comprehend, she felt not triumph, but a profound, exhausted grief for the man who had loved her enough to build this elaborate protection, who had known his own family well enough to understand the lengths they would go to claim what was never theirs, and who, even in death, had found a way to keep his promise that she and their sons would always be taken care of. The emergency custody hearing took place 2 days later in a Knox County courtroom that smelled of old wood and older grudges, and Richard Brennan arrived with 3 attorneys, 2 character witnesses, and the absolute confidence of a man who had never in his life faced consequences for his actions. He sat at the plaintiff's table in an expensive suit that had been pressed to perfection, his face composed in an expression of concerned family responsibility, while across the aisle Sarah sat with Whitmore and her 3 sons, all of them wearing clothes that Rosa had hastily purchased from a discount store because everything they owned had been lost or ruined in the mountain ordeal. Richard's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Caldwell who specialized in representing wealthy families in custody disputes, presented a devastating picture of Sarah as an unstable, delusional woman who had endangered 3 children by dragging them into a frozen wilderness on a fantasy treasure hunt based on a dead man's cryptic notes. He called a psychiatrist who had never met Sarah but testified based on a hypothetical profile that her behavior showed signs of decompensation and poor judgment. He called a social worker who claimed that the boys showed signs of neglect and that their living conditions in Rosa's trailer were unsuitable for children. Richard himself took the stand and played his role perfectly, speaking with controlled emotion about his deep love for his nephews, his concern for their welfare, and his belief that Sarah needed psychiatric help and that the boys needed stability and proper care that only a responsible family member could provide. It was a masterful performance, and Sarah felt her hope crumbling as she watched the judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Patricia Chen, take notes with an unreadable expression. Then Whitmore stood to present his case, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. He called Rosa Martinez first, who testified in simple, powerful language about Sarah's character, her devotion to her sons, and the cruelty she had endured at the Brennan estate. He called Frank from the general store, who described how the entire town had been poisoned against Sarah by the Brennan family's influence and how she had been systematically denied employment. He called Ranger Marcus Webb, still in his Forest Service uniform, who testified about finding Sarah and her sons fleeing from armed men, about the clear evidence of a prolonged pursuit through dangerous terrain, and about his military experience recognizing the difference between a mother protecting her children and a dangerous person endangering them. But the testimony that changed everything came from 3 former employees of the Brennan estate: a housekeeper, a groundskeeper, and a cook, all of whom had been quietly contacted by Whitmore's investigators, and all of whom were no longer dependent on Brennan money. They testified about Margaret's verbal abuse of Sarah and the children, about Richard's explosive temper and his constant complaints that Daniel's family was stealing his inheritance, about overhearing conversations where Richard and Margaret discussed ways to force Sarah to sign away her rights, and most devastatingly, about the slap Margaret had delivered to Noah's face and the cruel words she had used. The housekeeper wept as she described finding the boys hiding food to take to their puppies because they had been forbidden to keep them, and the cook testified that she had been ordered to serve Sarah and the children smaller portions than the rest of the family, as a way of reminding them they were unwelcome. Whitmore then presented photographs of the ice bridge, of the cabin, of the path through the wilderness, along with testimony from the sheriff's deputies who had arrested Richard's hired men, and he presented the trust documents showing that Richard had a $100 million motive for wanting Sarah declared incompetent. Judge Chen reviewed the evidence for 20 minutes in silence before delivering her ruling. The guardianship petition was denied. Richard Brennan and Margaret Brennan were prohibited from any contact with Sarah or her children, and she was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation into attempted fraud and child endangerment. Spring came to the mountains with a slow greening that transformed the stark winter landscape into something soft and full of promise. And it was on a warm April morning that Sarah drove into the town of Ashford in a reliable new SUV with her 3 sons buckled safely in the back, and Scout, Ranger, and Bear, now nearly full-grown golden retrievers, riding contentedly in the cargo area with their heads hanging out the open windows. The town looked exactly as she remembered it, the same brick buildings lining Main Street, the same mountains rising in the background. But everything had changed because Sarah was no longer the desperate woman who had been turned away from every business and subjected to whispers and cold stares. She was now Sarah Brennan, guardian of a trust worth over $100 million, and though she had kept her financial situation as quiet as possible, word had spread through the small community with the speed that only gossip in an insular mountain town could achieve. She drove past the businesses that had rejected her, past the pharmacy and the hardware store and the diner, and she felt no anger or desire for revenge, only a quiet satisfaction that she had survived their cruelty and emerged stronger. Her destination was not any of those places but a property on the mountainside just outside of town. 15 acres of wooded land with a newly constructed house that balanced modern comfort with mountain simplicity. All natural wood and stone and large windows that looked out over the valley. The house had 4 bedrooms, one for her and one for each of the boys so they could finally have their own space. And a large fenced yard where the dogs could run and play without the constant fear that had defined their lives at the trailer. Ethan, Noah, and Liam had transformed in the 3 months since the courthouse hearing, their faces filling out with regular meals, their bodies growing stronger with security and rest, and their spirits returning to the natural joy and curiosity of childhood that had been suppressed by trauma and poverty. They attended Mountain Ridge Elementary, a private school 30 minutes away where no one knew their history, and they were simply 3 bright boys who loved science and reading and playing with their dogs. Noah's ankle had healed completely. Liam had stopped having nightmares about being thrown out of the Brennan estate, and Ethan had begun to smile again, the worried expression of a child forced to be too adult too soon finally fading from his features. The dogs had grown into magnificent animals. Scout, now 65 pounds of lean muscle and boundless energy, Ranger slightly larger and the calmest of the three, and Bear living up to his name at 75 pounds with a deep chest and protective instincts that made him the self-appointed guardian of the boys. After settling into their new home and watching the boys run off with the dogs to explore their property, Sarah drove back into town to complete a piece of business that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with gratitude. Frank's general store sat on the corner where it had always been, and when Sarah pushed through the door, the bell chimed exactly as it had on that terrible day when she had been job hunting with no hope and 3 scared children. Frank was behind the counter, older and more tired looking than she remembered, and when he saw her, his weathered face broke into a genuine smile of recognition and warmth. They talked for an hour, Sarah sitting on the stool beside the counter while Frank explained that he was planning to close the store at the end of the month, that his arthritis made it impossible to manage the inventory, and his small pension was barely enough to live on, but certainly not enough to keep the business running. The store had been in his family for 60 years, he said with sadness in his voice, but sometimes things just came to an end, and there was nothing to be done about it. Sarah listened and nodded, and then she told him she had a proposition. She would buy the store, pay him a price well above market value that would ensure a comfortable retirement, hire a manager to run the daily operations, and keep the name Frank's General Store, because it was a name that represented kindness in a town that had forgotten what kindness meant. Frank stared at her in disbelief, his eyes filling with tears, and he asked her why she would do such a thing for an old man she barely knew. Sarah took his gnarled hand in hers and told him the truth, that on the worst day of her life, when the entire town had turned its back on her family, he had given her sons candy bars and treated them like human beings worthy of basic dignity. And that act of simple kindness had meant more than he could possibly know, and now she had the means to return that kindness 1,000-fold, and it would be her honor to do so. The investigation that Judge Chen had referred to the district attorney's office became a cascade that swept through the Brennan family's carefully constructed world like a flood through a house of cards, revealing rot and corruption that went back decades. Federal auditors examining the family's financial records discovered that Richard Brennan had been systematically embezzling from the family business accounts for over 10 years, taking what he believed was rightfully his inheritance and using it to fund a lifestyle of expensive cars, luxury vacations, and increasingly desperate investments in schemes that promised quick returns but delivered only losses. He had been so confident that he would eventually inherit the $100 million trust that he had treated the embezzled funds as merely an advance on money that already belonged to him, never imagining that his brother's widow and 3 small boys would have the strength or resources to fight him. The total amount he had stolen exceeded $4 million, and when the evidence was presented to the board of directors of Brennan Industries, they had no choice but to file criminal charges and begin the process of recovering what assets remained. Margaret Brennan, who had portrayed herself as a respectable pillar of the community, was revealed to have been fully aware of Richard's embezzlement and had actively helped him conceal it by falsifying documents and manipulating accounting records, making her not just complicit but an active participant in the fraud. She faced charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice, and though her attorneys negotiated a plea deal that kept her out of prison due to her age, the conditions required her to forfeit nearly all of her remaining assets to restitution and to accept 5 years of probation, during which her finances would be monitored by the court. The Grand Brennan estate, mortgaged beyond its value and seized by creditors, was sold at auction for a fraction of what it had once been worth, and Margaret moved into a modest apartment in a town 3 hours away where no one knew her name or her shame. The social destruction was perhaps even more devastating than the legal consequences, because the mountain communities that had once treated the Brennan name with reverence now spoke it with contempt and disgust. Former friends and business associates who had shunned Sarah at the family's direction now understood they had been manipulated into participating in a cruel conspiracy against an innocent woman and her children, and many of them reached out with letters of apology that Sarah read but did not answer because some wounds were too deep for words to heal. The businesses that had refused to hire her suddenly discovered they had openings and would be honored if she would consider them. But those offers went unanswered as well, because Sarah had learned the hard lesson that fair-weather kindness was worthless, and that true character was revealed not in times of plenty, but in times of desperation. 6 months after the custody hearing, a letter arrived at Sarah's new address. forwarded by her attorney, written in Richard's distinctive handwriting on cheap prison stationery. It was 5 pages of self-justification and pleading, explaining that he had only done what any man would do to claim what was rightfully his, that Sarah should understand he was a victim of his grandfather's irrational prejudice, and that as a Christian woman, she had an obligation to show mercy and perhaps use her resources to help him with his mounting legal bills and the restitution he was required to pay. The letter suggested that Daniel would have wanted his family to reconcile, that the boys deserved to know their uncle, and that surely after all this time Sarah could find it in her heart to forgive and perhaps even provide financial assistance, since she had more money than she could ever need. Sarah read the letter once, sitting at her kitchen table while spring sunshine streamed through the windows and she could hear her sons laughing outside with their dogs, and then she folded it carefully, placed it in her filing cabinet in a folder labeled Brennan Family Legal Matters, and never responded because some betrayals were beyond forgiveness, and some people had earned nothing but silence. A year after the inheritance was secured and the legal battles were finally over, Sarah stood on a viewing platform overlooking the place where 3 mountain streams converged and watched as construction crews put the finishing touches on the building that would become the headquarters of the Daniel Brennan Foundation, a structure designed to blend into the landscape with the same thoughtful simplicity that had characterized everything her husband built. The foundation had been Sarah's answer to a question that had haunted her since that day in the bank vault when she first understood the magnitude of what Daniel had left behind. What do you do with $100 million when you have spent months understanding what it means to have nothing? The answer had come to her slowly, emerging from memories of Daniel's values and his grandfather's final words about wealth being measured not in dollars, but in the quality of the family you built and the kindness you showed to those with less power. The Daniel Brennan Foundation would provide financial assistance, legal support, counseling services, and practical help to widowed parents raising children alone, people who were facing the same desperate poverty and institutional cruelty that Sarah had survived. The foundation's mission was simple. No parent should have to choose between feeding their children and keeping a roof over their heads. No child should go to bed hungry because their surviving parent could not find work, and no family should face homelessness because grief and bad luck had conspired against them. Sarah had partnered with existing social service agencies, established relationships with family law attorneys who would provide pro bono services, and created an emergency fund that could deliver immediate cash assistance to families in crisis without the weeks of bureaucratic delay that characterized most charitable organizations. The foundation's headquarters was built on the exact site of Daniel's cabin, which had been carefully dismantled and reconstructed log by log as the centerpiece of the new building, preserved behind glass as a memorial to the man whose love and foresight had made everything possible. The larger structure surrounding it contained offices, meeting rooms, a library, and comfortable spaces where families could come to receive help without feeling like supplicants begging for charity. Sarah had hired Rosa Martinez as the foundation's director of family services, giving her friend not just a job but a purpose and a salary that allowed her to finally retire from taking in sewing at all hours. And Rosa had thrown herself into the work with the fierce dedication of someone who understood poverty and loss from personal experience. Marcus Webb had left the Forest Service to become the foundation's security director, not because they anticipated threats, but because he had told Sarah that after meeting her family on that frozen trail, he could not go back to checking permits and monitoring campfires when he could be doing something that actually mattered. The opening day ceremony took place on a brilliant October morning when the mountains were painted in gold and crimson, and a small crowd of invited guests gathered on the viewing platform. James Whitmore and his family, Judge Patricia Chen, representatives from social service agencies across 3 states, and a handful of reporters from regional newspapers who had followed Sarah's story from eviction to vindication. But the most important moment came after the speeches and ribbon cutting, when Sarah led Ethan, Noah, and Liam, now 8 years old and healthy and strong, down the path to the spot near their father's reconstructed cabin where the oak tree from the photograph still stood. She had brought 3 young oak saplings, each one carefully selected from a nursery, and she gave one to each of her sons along with a shovel. The boys dug holes in the rich mountain soil with the serious concentration of children who understood they were doing something significant, and they planted their trees in a line facing the converging streams, each sapling a living memorial to their father and a symbol of growth and persistence. Scout, Ranger, and Bear, now full-grown golden retrievers who had never left the boys' sides, sat watching with the patience of dogs who had learned that sometimes the humans needed to do important things that did not involve throwing sticks or giving belly rubs. As Sarah watched her sons pat the soil around their saplings and water them from bottles filled at the stream, she thought about Daniel's letter and his instruction to teach them that wealth without kindness was poverty, and she knew that this foundation, this place where broken families could come to find help and hope, was the truest expression of his values and the most meaningful use of his grandfather's fortune. And that somehow, in the rustle of leaves and the music of flowing water, she could feel him standing beside her, proud of what they had built together, even though he had been gone for so long. Another year had passed, and Sarah stood on the porch of their mountain home on a warm evening in late summer, watching Ethan, Noah, and Liam race across the wide lawn with Scout, Ranger, and Bear bounding beside them, the three golden retrievers now fully grown and magnificent, their coats gleaming gold in the fading sunlight as they played an elaborate game that involved much running and laughter and the kind of pure joy that comes only from absolute security and unconditional love. The boys were 9 now, tall and healthy, and thriving in ways that the desperate, frightened children huddled in that freezing trailer could never have imagined. And the dogs had grown from clumsy puppies into noble companions who still slept at the foot of their boys' beds every night and still sensed when any of them was sad or scared and needed a warm presence pressed against their side. Sarah held Daniel's letter in her hands, the paper now soft from being folded and unfolded so many times over the past 2 years, and she read again the final paragraph that had become her guiding principle. If you're reading this, I'm gone, but I built this foundation so our boys would never know cold, hunger, or cruelty. Teach them that wealth means nothing without kindness. Teach them that family is who stands beside you in the storm, not who shares your blood. Teach them to be men who build, who protect, who love. That's the real inheritance. She folded the letter and placed it in her pocket over her heart, and she smiled as she watched Liam tackle his brothers in a heap while the dogs piled on top of them. And she knew with absolute certainty that she had kept Daniel's promise. The $100 million had given them security and opportunity, had allowed her to help other families avoid the suffering she had endured, had ensured her sons would never face the cruelty and rejection she had survived. But it was not the money that had saved them. It was the journey itself, the loyalty of 3 puppies who became heroes, the courage her sons had shown in that frozen wilderness, the unbreakable bond between a mother and her children who had faced darkness together and emerged into light, and the simple truth that family was not defined by blood or wealth, but by who stood beside you when the world turned cold and cruel and everything seemed lost. That was the real inheritance, the true fortune Daniel had left behind, and it was worth more than all the money in all the banks in all the world.